Today we're going to look at the last piece in this study on the Bible, and the title of this lesson is Revelation Made Accessible, and then in parentheses, not necessarily easy. Accessible but not easy, and that's probably as close as I want to get to an interpretation of Revelation. What we're going to do today is look at the type of literature that it is without diving into specific interpretive kind of tracks, although I will give you a framework for understanding it. There are actually several ways to look at this literature, this piece of the text, this book of the Bible. And there are at least 4 different frameworks that people use to interpret it. And so when you're reading a commentary on Revelation, it's important to understand the author's presuppositions before you get into the interpretive thing, because that will frame the way an author looks at the material and the way the author interprets the material. And as long as you're aware of those presuppositions, it will guide you in that, and it'll say, okay, I may not necessarily agree with this interpretation, but I understand why the author presents it as such. And when I was growing up, I think I told you that I grew up in a more fundamental-leaning Baptist church. I never knew there was more than one way to look at the book of Revelation. It was always only, this is the only way that we understand this text. And it was pretty scary. And in fact, when I got to college and began looking at the Bible from a more academic standpoint, I was stunned to find out there was a different way to read the book of Revelation. And not that suddenly opened up the whole, it just said, oh, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Okay, I'm okay with that. And so I will not claim to be the absolute authority on what does this book mean. And I think anybody who does is dancing on thin ice. It's not an easy book to wade through, but we can make it more accessible, and that's what we want to do today. So let me begin with identifying some of the problems with this book. And there's 4 specific ones that I want to address with you this morning. And the first is the first problem I want to address is the type of literature that it is, because it's actually a mixture of literature. It has pieces of apocalyptic in it. It has pieces of prophecy, and it has the earmarks of a letter, of an epistle. And so all 3 of those things combine to make for an interesting omelet when you're looking at the book of Revelation, because it's like, well, which part are we looking at now? Are we looking at the apocalyptic piece of that? Are we looking at the prophetic aspect of it? Or are we just concerned with the epistle here? And so there are some earmarks that kind of guide us through those chunks in the book, but it's important to recognize which chunk you're in terms of how do you really grab what's being said. And sometimes these elements kind of bleed together in some places. And so it's important to bear in mind that you're dealing with a document that has a lot of different pieces and a lot of different kind of ways of understanding. So apocalyptic literature here is this is a feature of apocalyptic literature. It is looking forward to the time when God would bring a radical end to history, the triumph of good, and the final judgment on evil. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, the apocalyptic message or the apocalyptic aspect of this book. Apocalyptic literature is unique in biblical literature. Well, it's not unique to biblical literature, but in biblical literature, apocalyptic serves as a means of providing hope, and I think we talked about this when we looked at the Old Testament, providing hope in perplexing or uncertain or oppressive times without giving specifics about how it will turn out, but the promise that it will turn out in language that helps to put this into an epic kind of format. So this has, Revelation has kind of an epic feel to it. And when we're talking about epics, we're talking like, the Odyssey or Beowulf, those kinds of things. And that's just kind of literature, fictional literature. It's not really fictional, but it has that same kind of feel to it. It is an epic story. It's not necessarily a history or an analysis of a particular issue per se, although there are moments when it does. It's actually a coded document that gives hope to the oppressed because they have inside information about what the author is referring to. But in that time that it's written, those outsiders who would read that, particularly the persecutors, wouldn't have a clue as to what's really being conveyed in the document because it's written in this coded language. And I have some of that coded language here for you, but I'll hand this out later so that you don't devour it in the moments that we're speaking. I do have a note in my notes that says handout here, and it's towards the end. So remind me if we don't get there. The other thing about apocalyptic literature is that it's not really concerned with God within history. Now, all of what we've been showing in the text is, where is God in the story? Remember, that's one of the fundamental questions that we've been asking in all the literature we looked at. Where is God in the story, to demonstrate that God is engaged in the particular moments and eras and so forth. But apocalyptic literature doesn't have that feature. It is God over history. And so it's an aspect of God's sovereignty. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about the next quarter, if we have that next quarter. One of the themes we'll talk about is the sovereignty of God. What does that mean? Because that's an important feature that's oftentimes misunderstood by people in our particular situation, because we have some predisposed animosity towards sovereign kind of ideas, so we don't really understand what the text is trying to convey when it uses that term. And so but apocalyptic literature, particularly this one, is concerned with God over history. And so, in a sense, that apocalyptic literature gives a general sense of, here's how things will turn out. But in terms of the specifics of, when and how and who and those kinds of things, that's less clear. That's less clear. And that'll become true. So apocalyptic literature does not try to give, it is not the same as like Isaiah or Matthew or any of those other books that try to speak to specific incidents. And that'll become important in a moment, because some of the other features of apocalyptic literature that we'll look at in a second here. So, secondly, the book, the type of literature it is, it's prophetic in the sense that it is a word for the present. I mean, there is something for the original readers in the Word. And so it is a prophetic sense to them, and it does speak about their particular circumstances at that time. And so we have to bear that in mind, that it wasn't simply sealed until the end. It's not like John was writing this saying, this is going to be really interesting stuff for you to read, but it has nothing to do with your present situation. But devour it anyways, and because there'll be a test. That's not at all what it is. I mean, the end of the book of Daniel is interesting, because the end of the book of Daniel is what? Don't worry about this kind of stuff. You're losing sleep over this, and I mean, but you don't have to worry about this, because this is not going to happen until when? The end of time. And you're not going to last until then. So relax. Take it easy. That's not what the book of Revelation says. So there is a contemporary piece to it for the people who originally received it. And so there is within that book a tension between what's often identified as already and not yet. You know what we mean by that. So the already aspects of what it means to be in the kingdom and the not yet aspects of it, the fuller dimension to come. So that is one of the tensions that's at work in this literature. Then it is also an epistle, because it is written to specific people, and it starts out like a regular letter. You know, I, John, blah, 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 I was here, and this is what happened, and so forth. And it's sent as a letter to specific churches. But what's interesting is that John is really just the mouthpiece, because who does the letter really come from? Jesus. It comes from Jesus. So it's a word from Jesus to the churches, and then John records the kinds of things that, you know, like in chapter 4 when it says, come up here now and I'll show you what must take place. And then John is just simply narrating what John is seeing and all of that. But the letter is from Jesus, and it's sent to specific churches, specific communities. And there are 7 of them. And so... So this was, and it talks about the features of many of them, or it talks about the features of all of them, and some of them are good and some of them are not so good. And it's interesting to look at, and you know, this because of the date of writing. It's being written at the end of the 1st century. And so you look at a place like Ephesus to the Ephesians, which was one of Paul's, you know, like major places of ministry, and a place where it's just this great epistle to the Ephesians that has absolutely no kind of problems in the church and so forth. But you get to Ephesus in Revelation, it's kind of, you know, you guys have kind of fallen off the rails a little bit. I mean, you're still really good, but you know, this has happened, and you need to address that. So interesting that it is to specific churches with specific issues in their contemporary situation in mind. But it is also an occasional document. You remember we talked about occasional documents, and they are occasioned by something. Well, what is the occasion for this document, do you think? Remember the time period, end of the 1st century. What's going on in contemporary history? Persecution. And a particular type of persecution. The empire is actively persecuting the church. And so, yeah. That happened in 70 AD, but then that's when the official persecution from the empire towards the church began in earnest. And so this is the occasion that prompts the writing of this epistle, because they are in the midst of incredible persecution. And, you know, given the fact that there was this sense among the emerging Christians of the 1st century that it's only going to get better and better and better, and then Christ will come, you know, the letter comes because it ain't working out that way. It's kind of like, what's up, you know? And so the letter kind of comes as a corrective to a little bit of that, you know, I don't use this term, I won't use the term. So it comes as a little bit of corrective to that misguided view. And it just says, no, the reality is this. The outcome is this. But the reality is, it ain't going to be this for a while. And so so that's a bit of the flavor that prompts the writing of this book to say, don't give up. Don't give up. And so that's one of the first problems of the book. What part of literature are we looking at as we're trying to read and interpret this book? The second problem with the book is whether it is literal or symbolic. That's a big question in the interpretive, you know, realm. So there are people there are folks who say that everything that's written in the Bible should be taken as literal unless it is, you know, clearly not, which is unhelpful in every situation. Because what is the key to when it is not clearly literal? And that key is what people pass around in the different commentaries. Well, this is the key kind of a thing. although it's just somebody's preference. So the problem of the literalist approach is, well, which part is literal and which isn't? Because they both sound remarkably similar. They're using terms that are, so if they were using very obscure, arcane, academic, scholarly terms about something, then you could say, okay, that's clearly symbolic, because nobody understands what that means anyways. So, but the fact is that John isn't using that language. John is using very clear, plain language. And so how do you know? The text itself testifies to its symbolic nature because of the symbols that are used. It's framing it in coded language, which is right here. This is the key. This is the key. Secret code right there. So, by the way, did I tell you I was charging for this? No. So, symbolism is part of the apocalyptic style. Okay, so that's part of the problem with the literature that's mixed like this, because symbolism is a feature of apocalyptic literature. It's a necessary part of apocalyptic literature. And so how do you know when you're looking at a symbol or you're looking at something that's real? So it kind of almost has to be one way or the other. And if you have to lean in one direction, I think you have to lean more in the symbolic, figurative direction, because it's a safer place to stand. And part of it is simply because there's too much of it there to parse and say, well, is this an actual thing or so forth? We have to remember that the message really is conveyed in visions. So what we have here in the book of Revelation is an IMAX kind of thing that John is experiencing. And so you're in a 50-foot movie theater watching these ideas and themes play out. And in order to really understand the book of Revelation or the thing, you have to take these visions and or what's written here and project them back into a vision. That would be a very cool movie, is to take these things and portray them on the screen, because that's what John is doing. Now, when you're watching a movie, how are you paying attention to every single detail in the scene? You're not, but the one who created the movie did. There's nothing accidental in movies at all. It's very, very intentional. If you see a particular picture on the back of a wall in a movie scene, it's there for a purpose. And it may not be immediately clear, but it's there for a reason. If a person uses a particular brand of something, that's very important. They paid for they paid to use that particular brand. And so everything that happens, the way they're dressed, everything is in fact, there's a whole cadre of people whose mission in life is to find the mistakes in movies. They really exist, and so they have this great fun. You say, oh, did you notice it? And so nothing happens in the movies by accident. It's all very, very intentional. And that's true about this book, too. As you look at it, it's all very intentional. The author intends every piece of it, but you can't pay attention to every detail. And the idea is not necessarily to just focus on all the details. That's not what you do in a movie. But all those details kind of create the context for the idea that scene is trying to convey. And so the same thing is true with Revelation. It has all these details, but they're really just to convey the overall narrative that this section is trying to convey. So the point isn't to parse down the details to see if you can find some nugget in there that is the key, because I have it here. But the key to Revelation, that's not the point. The point is to translate it back into a vision and then take in the overall idea. That's really the point of that. So what is the vision doing? The third problem here is the scope of the message. To whom is it written and why? And why is it written? Well, in a sense, it's written particularly to followers of Jesus in the first century. But actually, it's written to all followers of Jesus in every century. And it's actually also kind of a warning to people who are impenitent and not followers of Jesus and don't want to be followers of Jesus. And there is this sense, and Dallas Willard puts it this way, he says, God will allow you to ignore Him. God honors that. But there is a time when that's no longer possible. Yeah, but God allows that now, but not always. And I think that that's an important point. Because here's the, if anyone asks you what is the interpretation of the book of Revelation, here's the answer. Okay? It's 2 words. Christ wins. That's it. That's it. That's the whole point of Revelation. Things are not what they seem. That's the point of the book of Revelation. Things are not what they seem. Because in that time, if you had to bet on who was going to prevail, the huge empire of Rome with all of its, armies and conquest and mechanisms that could just grind hope to fine powder, and this little fledgling church that's cropping up with people being kind and gracious and loving and accepting and welcoming and delighting in life and so forth, and just a little bit opposed to the idea that Caesar's God. So if you had to bet on the survival of these 2 institutions, which one would you bet on? Especially since Rome has already demonstrated quite a bit of domination over this little fledgling church. I mean, killed its leader, by the way, and then destroyed Jerusalem just because they didn't want to put up with the Jews anymore, and they could do it. If you were in the first century a disinterested party, you'd probably bet on Rome as surviving. But that's what the book of Revelation is here to say. Things are not what they seem. Yes, this is a logical point of view. However, it is not the permanent point of view. This, in fact, is what prevails. That's the book of Revelation in a nutshell. Christ wins. How does that happen? Good question. So let's move on. So the interpretive rule, remember the interpretive rule, this is the 4th problem, the interpretive rule that we talked about before. A text cannot mean what it never meant. Okay? A text cannot mean what it could never have meant to the original audience. All right? So, and this is particularly where that illustration about the Black Hawk helicopters comes in, because I've heard that referenced in here as an interpretation of Revelation. I've heard all kinds of weaponry, identified here, and all kinds of, well, this is actually an F-15, whatever that is, or, yeah, it's a nuclear bomb because this is the way nuclear, it can never have meant what it never could have meant to the original audience. That rule is important because it had to make sense to them. It had to have meaning for its original audience. So that doesn't always reveal the meaning of the text, but it does rule some things out. So you may not know exactly what is meant, but you can know that it can't even come close to meaning that. So there are some things it rules out. So just bear that in mind as you're reading through the book of Revelation. All right. So with all the problems that we've talked about, what is a way to understand Revelation? And one of the best ways, at least in my experience of understanding the book of Revelation, comes from a book by William Hendrickson called More Than Conquerors. So if you are looking for a book on how to understand this, I would recommend that. I came across this book a long time ago, and it makes the most sense to me. That doesn't mean other interpretations might not be equally valid. Perhaps, I'm sure there are. My my boss at the university when I worked there wrote his dissertation on the book of Revelation. Talk about punishment. He wrote his dissertation on the book of Revelation. Interestingly enough, the entire dissertation came out to 666 pages.
What?
I looked at it and said, oh, you are not going to pass. They're not going to accept that. His wife looked at it and said, you got to add some more notes at the end because you got to make it 667 or take some out, but you can't come up with 666. I mean, he didn't plan it that way, but it just turned out that way, and he said, no, I'm doing it. And he turned it in, and they noted that too. So anyhow, that was just, I thought, a very funny coincidence. But anyhow, this book, William Hendrickson, More Than Conquerors, is what will kind of inform the rest of what I'm going to share this morning about that. So Hendrickson makes the case in his book that Revelation is a series of 7 divisions that cover the same period of time. All right? All 7 visions in the book of Revelation, here they are. All of those cover the same period of time. And the time is between the first and second coming of Christ. That's the period of time in which these visions cover. So the divisions or the visions are parallel visions. They're not chronological. They're parallel visions. Each section represents a different perspective or a different moment or a different sphere of activity in the world at that time. And so it's just covering the same amount of time from a different point of view. And so that you see what's happening in this realm. Because you remember, things are not what they seem. That's Revelation's kind of hidden code. Things are not what they seem. So they're not what they seem in the economic sphere. They're not what they seem in the religious sphere. They're not what they seem in the political sphere. They're not what they seem in the cultural sphere. You know, so this is what Revelation is doing, is showing, breaking down all these different divisions that we use to figure out what is life all about, and saying it doesn't, this is what happens between this event and this event, the first and second coming of Christ. And so when you're trying to interpret it, you have to bear that idea in mind to say, okay, what is then that range, or what is that realm that is being discussed in this section, in this moment? So you can't kind of put them together and say, first this happens, then this happens, then this happens next. Remember, this is what people did with the book of Genesis at the beginning, right? First day, God did this. Second day, God did this. Third day, God did that. Fourth day, God did this. They thought it was chronological. Remember, we looked at the fact that it was actually a poetic description of creation, not a chronological, like this happened day one, like this was, Monday, and God got up and went, whoa, I got to do something, and so He creates something. And so it was a poetic description of creation. And the same thing is true here. This is not a chronological sequence. So what's happening? So Revelation reveals progress in the intensity of spiritual conflict. And that intensity grows from the time of Christ's appearance to the time of the second coming. That intensity of spiritual conflict grows the closer we get to this time. And that's part of what the message of the book of Revelation is all about, is that this intensity, the conflict, is going to increase, and here's the evidence for that. Here's how you see that beginning to happen. Now, the 7 visions are divided into 2 major sections. And so this is what we have here, section 1 and then section 2. There's 2 major divisions. And the first one is the one talking about, this is the physical struggle, okay? And then what would you think the second one would be? The spiritual, yes. So this is the spiritual struggle, the spiritual warfare that's going on. So chapters 1 through 11, and then chapters 12 through 22. This is the division of those visions. So the physical struggle is between believers and unbelievers. That's the basis of the struggle that's being described, because whenever and wherever the light of Christ appears, the darkness rebels against it. Okay? So that's an underlying theme in these areas. How does the light of Christ appear, and how does the darkness respond to it? And so the world attacks the church, but the church is avenged, protected, and victorious. That's the things are not what they seem. Right? Because in the first century, who was being attacked? The church was being attacked. People were being killed. All of that. But the idea was that the church would overall be avenged, protected, and victorious. And so we had to, what? Trust that God is in control. That's the sovereignty piece. God is in control of what is going on. And so this doesn't say, well, God has a purpose and you're going to the Colosseum, to face lions. That's not how they interpreted that. It's not like, well, God has a plan. Good luck. The world attacks the church. That's the idea. And it's subtle at first, and there are periods where it's more intense than other times, and that's shown in the book of Revelation as well. Sometimes it is very intense, and sometimes it kind of backs off a little bit, and it appears somewhere else. And so, but as history moves to that second coming time, the intensity gets very, very sharp. Just like it did in Christ's ministry. Remember the 3 years of his public ministry? It started out rather benign, People thought, oh, this is a nice guy. He's a rabbi. He's a teacher. It's amazing. He speaks like nobody has ever spoken before. He does marvelous things, so forth. But as you get towards the end, the conflict between the religious leaders and Jesus gets very, very intense, doesn't it? It grows through that time. And that was kind of a microcosm of the whole of history. This is the same way. Remember, and Jesus said, as they treated me, so shall they what? Treat you. Treat you. But if they listen to me, they'll listen to you. So, and it's enough for the student to be like the teacher. Right? So that's the goal. And it's not necessary to correct it. Did Jesus go in and correct us and say, listen, you guys have this all wrong. This is the way the temple is supposed to be. This is the way the government is supposed to be. This is what your local city council is supposed to be doing. And this is the way the synagogue is supposed to be. Did he do that? Not at all. He lived within the framework of the culture and the norms and all of that to show how it was to live the life that God designed for humanity to live in any circumstance. And he did that among all the different cultures that he engaged in. And he showed how, just by his own behavior, how that contrasted and in fact critiqued what was going on in his own time. So that in fact, the answer to bad situations is not to destroy those situations, but to demonstrate an alternative that makes that stupid or obsolete or unpleasant or kind of, people go, well, of course we wouldn't want to do that. So the critique is living better and living all that. So part of Revelation is that support of that idea and to show that, yes, the intensity grows, but at the end of time, Christ prevails. So don't give up hope. Don't like Paul says in Corinthians, he says the weapons of 2 Corinthians 10. The weapons of our warfare are not like the world's weapons, right? So the problem that we sometimes run into is that we get tired of using, or we don't really use the spiritual warfare weapons. We just get tired of getting trampled on. So what do? We go pick up the arms, and start doing what they do, the same intensity, and that's just a trap, because that never ends well for anybody. So that's why Paul says, don't do this. Our weapons are not their type. So 1 through 11, the physical struggle. The second part, the spiritual warfare, and it shows that the struggle on earth has a deeper background. That's the point. To say, things are not what they seem, right? On the one hand, we see this. What is driving this? That's the second part. That's the spiritual struggle. This is what's driving what's going on in the physical. So it's the underlying conflict between Christ and the dragon who appears in that second part. And that goes all the way back to what? Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. So the enmity between, the Assyrian, so that's being played out in the spiritual warfare. And you see glimpses of it back again in some of the prophetic books and the apocalyptic books of the Old Testament, particularly in places where I think it's Daniel, where he prays and then it takes a while for the answer to come. And the answer actually comes from an archangel who says, I would have been here sooner, but I got delayed for 3 weeks because of this thing going on here and so forth. So there is a spiritual struggle behind the physical thing. And so we don't always see that spiritual struggle taking place. That's kind of why the book of Revelation is written, to show the believers there is a bigger arena. And you don't always know what's happening in that bigger arena. And that's why we have to trust what God is doing. So here's the sections and their corresponding visions, and I've written them on the board for you in case you want to write them down. These are the basic topics of those sections, and in order to understand and interpret the book, you have to interpret it by the sections. And remember that we're talking about the same period of time in all of them. The first and second coming of Christ. This is the period that all of these cover. And so what is the message of each of these sections with this in mind? That's what you want to discern in that moment. So don't look at a single verse in here and say, okay, what does this verse mean? Well, it may mean a number of different things depending on when you're looking at this, where you're looking at it, what language you're in, what culture you're in. It may look like a lot of different things. What is the overall point? That's what you need to look at. What is the overall point, not the singular thing? And we're almost to the handout, but not yet. So what are some helpful clues? What are some helpful clues in when you're looking at the book of Revelation? Well, it is helpful to pay attention to major symbols in the book. And so, for instance, 3 of the major symbols in the book. Anybody want to take a guess? Trumpets? Seals and bowls. Yep, that's them. The seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. So those are major symbols that are at work in this book. And so the seals are in chapter 6 through 8, verse 1. And then the trumpets are chapter 8, verse 2 through 11:19. And then the bowls are chapter 15 to 16, verse 21. So seals are really describing the trials and persecutions of believers. And again, the idea is opposition arises when Christ appears. So when Christ comes, so does the opposition. But a seal conveys what? Ownership,